We're now live on YouTube with the January 29th. January, wow, that's a weird way to say January. With the January 29th meeting of the Node.js modules team. We are joined by 10 individuals today, quite exciting. And we have a full agenda, so we'll get right to it. The first item that we have on the agenda here is, actually this is all mixed up, so let's see what we want to do. So we have from Node.js work in process, move ESM loaders to worker thread. Brad, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So not much has gone on for this. We did get some requests, particularly about how this would remove dynamic instantiate. We haven't made a PR to completely remove it because we're not landing this PR right yet. But we also did get some interesting facts about people using dynamic instantiate. They are actually doing so to mutate globals sometimes. So I've been trying to figure out what the best way to allow people to mutate the globals is going to be there. I'm not quite sure the direction we want to go for that, but it seems like we need to introduce some sort of hook into the loaders for that. It could be just run some source text when you create a new context, or it might be a list of URLs that should be imported at the startup of a context. And I've been looking at kind of hyphen import and what that would mean if we made a flag for that, because that would closely mirror having a list of URLs that have to be loaded. After going through and trying to proof of concept that it is going to be very hard for us to PR hyphen import because timing problems and the bootstrap. So I'm kind of back at the drawing board and trying to figure out what we want to do. I think we could make it so that loaders could just basically arbitrarily execute straight resources provided from the loader itself before running stuff. But I'm unclear on how that would work if we ever support common JS interception. So yeah, that's the whole update.
Great. Anyone have any questions? Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, what about dynamic instantiate? I know we talked in the thread about removing it, but that's kind of just been kind of sitting there. Do we want to move forward with that?
People are already using it. I don't think we can remove it unless we have something that fills their needs.
Okay, and what would be filling their needs in its place, do you think?
They are using it to punch globals. So they're not even using it to load a module. They are just creating a fake dynamic module because it gets access to globals before other code runs. Yeah.
All right. Sorry, Myles.
Yeah, no worries. So moving forward, I just double checking one issue really quickly. I'd like us to start quickly with the discussion around, unless people have a problem with bumping this to the top, we received some issues, I think it was early this week, about people who are using conditional imports, getting the experimental conditional exports warning when like if they weren't supporting conditional exports, it would be like the equivalent. So like specifically in the case of someone has a project, that project natively supports CJS, they want to offer support for ESM, they want to use conditional exports to be able to do it because they want to use the exports field. But the second that they do that, they're getting the various warnings in the console, which is to design right now. But in the case that, like, let's say the main entry point is identical to the require entry point, in theory, it could like fall back to that, and like whether or not there should be a warning is kind of up in the air. Does anyone have a concern with kind of discussing this first? Because
so this specifically came up for me with the next version, like V2 of Resolve, has conditional exports in the package JSON, and in an attempt to be like, I want to use the feature and be as feature compatible as possible and so on, I've defined require, import, and default for all of my entry points. And in the case of the require entry point and the default entry point, they are all identical to what it would be if I just deleted the exports field. That's my like back compatibility approach. So I don't mind the warning when you import dynamically or statically, but I got an issue filed on the next tag of Resolve V2, basically saying that the require warning was annoying. Can we remove require from the exports field? And so I did it because I don't want the warning, but like, because so that's kind of like, I'm basically wondering, like, I think we want the warning if the conditional export would result in a different module. But if it would result in the same module, it seems like the warning doesn't really serve a purpose, but there might be like an implementation cost or like in terms of complexity or whatever to differentiating those. So I thought it was worth discussing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a change that we would want to make, but like I personally think I'd be comfortable with before throwing the warning, essentially doing a check to see if the export require was the same as main. Like that seems very reasonable. Now, the only challenge to that I would say gets kind of weird is like we probably don't want to do that support for all of the deep imports or deep exports, but then it starts becoming really edge casey because like it isn't actually the same if you require the thing and get the same stuff if someone's used conditional exports, because they're still using exports, which should have I guess export still has a warning, right? Or does
So one thing that might be really simple is if require and default are identical, don't issue the warning when requiring. Yeah,
but what I'm getting at, and I want to just double check the behavior here, is do we have a warning just if you have an exports field?
No. If I with only require usage, the only time the warning appears is if I've defined a require conditional export. So just having the exports field, there's no warning issued with the default or the string shorthand, or even an array that selects between the two of them. Like there's no warning in any of the Node versions that I've checked.
Yeah, I'm just double checking that right now, and
it's sure
to be the case.
I mean,
but like it does seem
there be a warning though if like exports is still experimental, isn't it? Like if you're using just path mappings like /foo to foo.js or whatever, like and leaving conditionals out of it, shouldn't that throw the warning?
I wasn't running on 13. Let me just double check. Yeah, like my gut is if you're doing anything that touches exports, I believe there should be a warning, which is maybe the opposite direction that people.
Yeah, that's not the direction I would want. I mean, if that is in fact what we want, then I would have to remove the exports field from like 12 packages or something, because I don't want that warning issued.
I mean, if it's an experimental feature, then it's an experimental.
No, I get it. I'm not saying that's a justification, that's a defense against like, therefore we shouldn't have the warning. I'm just saying like that would be an unfortunate consequence. And I think it would drastically inhibit adoption. People don't want that warning when, if someone's using import, they're using they're using an experimental feature. So seeing an experimental warning is fine, no matter where it comes from. But if they're using require, they're not using an experimental feature. So like,
I guess, Jordan, even if they're using require, and then Brad and Jan have their hands up, but even if they're using require, if the package author has used exports in there, which is experimental. And even if the mains are the same, the deep entry is not the same. They're overall, it's like it's not like it is not the same equivalent package with exports and without exports.
Right. No, I get that. Like I think there's an
Right.
argument. I mean, I see the argument for what they're saying. Anyway, sorry. I'll let the people who have their hands raised answer.
Sure. Would it be possible, at least for you, Jordan, to ship an index file instead of a main? It just routes it to the right place.
So I mean, I'm using the exports field both to remap dot and also to remap like explicit entry points. I'm in all those cases, the explicit entry points exist anyway, so that if you delete exports and you use the same left-hand side specifiers, the package is identical. But like, I don't see how removing my main field would help, because most of my main fields
So-
just point to an explicit index anyway.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Are we giving the warning even when there isn't a main field?
No, so at the moment, my understanding based on my experience is that the only time you get a warning when using require is if you've defined a require field in a conditional export.
Okay, never mind then.
Jan?
Yeah. So I guess we have. For me, the decision is basically: do we want any packages published to npm to use exports right now? If we say yes, we want people to publish it, then it feels like there's exactly two ways that would make them want to publish it, and that is either the warning is removed, or alternatively, exports goes back again behind a flag. Because if it's behind a flag, then they don't care, because the consumers will only see it if they explicitly opt into it. Maybe the answer is that we don't want people to ship anything with exports to npm, but I think if we do, those are the two options that I'm seeing.
That makes sense to me. To me, if we don't want people to publish it, it shouldn't be unflagged.
I think there's, if I can butt in, sorry, I think there's
Yeah, go.
maybe a third option. I don't know, or maybe not. I'm not sure if this is possible, but I would think that like what we really want, correct me if I'm wrong, is like we want the package authors to see a warning that like they're using something that's experimental, but not necessarily the end users who are just installing something off of npm. Like if that were somehow possible.
We do
Yeah,
have
if that's
a-
possible, that's fine.
That is something that I believe we have prior art in core to. I think we did it for the buffer API, where we only threw the warning for package authors but not consumers. Jan, your hand is up.
Sorry, mistake.
Well,
Okay.
I guess regardless of whether it's, I mean, I guess we could assume it's possible somehow. Is that what we want?
So, I mean, something that I'm seeing that isn't really making sense to me right now is I'm doing some tests right now and not seeing the warning. I'm trying to figure out why that is the case. So I'm working with Node 13 right now. Maybe there's something wrong in my example, but I'll dig more into this. Like, yeah, I guess the challenge here is that if we want packages to start using experimental exports, I guess like one other option that we could explore, although I don't know if we want to add this to the algorithm, is for conditional exports. If you are requiring and there is not a require that is defined, you could fall back to the main, in which case it's technically not using the exports functionality. But the challenge and the thing that I like, yeah, like, because we don't have any, it doesn't seem like we have any warning that throws if you just use exports.
Correct. Like right now, I have a number of most of my packages don't have conditional exports. They only have default in the object form, and there's no warning issued by a require with that. And the way I've built them, if we shipped a node thing that, like a new node version that skipped exports unless require was specified, then that wouldn't break anything. My packages would just pretend like suddenly start like pretending like they didn't have an exports field. So that's fine. It just means I can't test the feature. But like what Geoffrey was saying sounds good to me. Like as the package author, I don't mind seeing you can spew warnings at me all day long for things that are my fault. But as a package consumer, I don't want to see warnings from packages because of things an author did. And if like as an author, I would not want to cause that. And so I wouldn't use any feature that spewed warnings for my users. So I don't know if it is possible, but like if what Geoffrey suggested is a way forward, like if we could say like, when requiring any path in the current package, or when using the self-reference feature or something, we spew the warning. I don't know, like that would be fine. But yeah, like the consequence of the current state is that I use default and import as much as possible, but I can't use require. And if we warned more often, then I would, basically be removing the exports field. If we put it behind a flag, that's fine. But then no one can test it out. And, that's just, there's like a lot of options in front of us, and we can also leave it as it is. Right. And, until April or whatever, but like, it just kind of seemed weird to me that by adding require, I suddenly started getting this warning, even when require and default and the normal resolution would have resulted in the same file.
Mm-hmm. So, Jan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think coming back to my earlier point and kind of following up on what John said, the whole point of having the experimental is that we want people to try it. And I think exports is somewhat special in that people cannot meaningfully try it if they can't publish it. So I think it's a place where warning is weird because it goes directly against people being able to actually try it. Because without publishing, it doesn't really have a meaningful user experience that people would actually be able to observe.
I think I'm next.
Yeah.
I think so. One thing I'm pretty sure about, and if anyone disagrees with this, please speak up. I think we don't want exports and conditional exports to behave differently. Like if one's going to throw warnings, the other should throw warnings. Like it's not like one is any less experimental than the other. So the fact that exports, like plain exports, is not warning us right now is a bug, because that doesn't seem to be intentional. That said, yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought through all the consequences of this, but I if it seems okay with everyone else, maybe if we can somehow make the warnings only appear for package authors, maybe that could be the solution, I guess. And then the question would be, if we can't figure out a good way to do that, then maybe, like Jan said, we just don't show warnings for these two features.
Well, and another alternative is like, which would be a cheap check, I think, when we pull out the require condition, we can also say, is there a default condition and is it the same file? And if so, don't issue a warning. And if it's different, still issue the warning, because that would actually be differentiating between when conditional exports makes a difference over exports versus not. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think that goes against Jan's point of like trying to encourage people to actually test these things, because then
Sure.
it's like they're only quote unquote testing it with require, not with import, right?
Well, like so if we did what I just said, then all of my packages would eventually have require, import, and default specified in every object. And require and default would be the same, and import would point to an ESM wrapper around that CJS file. So the only thing I wouldn't be testing is having like require and default be different. But like,
Yeah, but how many users are gonna actually test your package using import if every time they try to import it, it throws a warning, you know?
that's
Like,
true.
don't we also want users to be doing that to test
true.
that?
Well, and that's already a case. Like I've made tests in my packages that use conditional exports to test the ESM stuff and use the self-references and whatnot. And I have to use I use dynamic import in those, and those issue like with self-reference, and those issue that warning. And so that is definitely a bit of an inhibition. But because all imports are experimental, like it didn't feel as bad to me. But you're right in that it potentially inhibits adoption in the same way.
I think Myles might be testing something. I can just call on people if you want, Myles.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm trying to test this out. I'm getting like really,
Sure.
really weird.
Jan?
Yeah, I think I'm getting to a point where I think we should remove the warning, because even if we would figure out a way to only warn the maintainers, I don't think that would really be meaningful, because like if I'm writing a library that I wanted to publish, I would see the warning only at the very beginning of running my test suite, that then gets immediately swallowed away by the output of my test suite. And it would just be noise, most likely. And I'm not sure if that is, it's not like the buffer warning where we then expect the maintainer to stop using buffer or the buffer constructor and then the warning goes away. It's just we are training the maintainers to ignore the warning because they cannot do anything that would remove the warning, as if they actually want to try it. So it doesn't feel like we are training people to do something good if we train a bunch of maintainers to ignore experimental warnings. So I would say, let's just remove the warning for exports. Keep it doc experimental, but have no runtime warning.
I mean, yeah,
For import as well, just to clarify.
or for any number of features related to modules, to be honest, because it's like,
I would say for any feature, well, for example, exports is a feature that is definitely controlled by the publisher. I care less about import, because the moment that the user is using imports, there's at least one warning anyhow. But for require, definitely there is no reason for why it should print something on the user side if the user cannot actually do anything about it. I think it's a little bit different for, I don't know, import JSON, for example, where the user where people maybe shouldn't be publishing code that uses import JSON, and testing the feature doesn't require you to publish code. So I think exports and anything else that has to do with resolution features or package publish features, that those are a little bit special to me.
or rather, and maybe a simpler way of putting it would be, if the end user isn't using a flag, they shouldn't probably be seeing warnings, like, right? I mean, that would only affect exports and conditional exports and self-resolve, I think. But like, we don't want the user to see warnings that they didn't themselves trigger by opting into it with a flag. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, because that's what's annoying to users. It's like, why is I getting this error? You know, I didn't opt into this, and I have no way to opt out of it other than to suppress all warnings. You know what I mean? I mean, the other thing I'm thinking is like, we're in 13. It's already marked as experimental in the docs. We can make some major changes before 14 if we want. So we can really change anything we want, but you know, until 14.00 in April, I think. So I don't know if we really even need these warnings or what they're really achieving. You know, if anything, they're just slowing adoption and experimentation.
Yeah, where I would draw the line is if the feature is experimental because we haven't committed yet to the exact API. So normally it is by design that we don't want people to publish anything using it, right? We don't
Right.
want package authors to adopt experimental WASM modules right now, or certain other, I'm not sure if we have other pending features that are currently triggering warnings. So
Maybe self-resolve.
normally it would be by design that package authors would not use exports right now because it's experimental, and not conditional exports because it's experimental. Normally, these features shouldn't be appearing in published packages. It's just that in this case, that is really hindering us being able to evaluate the feature if they don't. So the math changes slightly. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump over Jordan there.
No, it's like, I mean, this is something I've said throughout this entire working group process, is that modules are a uniquely different thing than all other features because it like is viral in the ecosystem. And I think that in general, like errors should punish the people who can change them. And then failing that, they should exert social pressure on those people indirectly, right? So like if somebody publishes a package that uses, you know, I don't know, like WASM, like you said, like it's fine if all of their users see warnings too, because their users need to know that the author like maybe shouldn't use this or that there's caveats. But like in this case, there's just not a there's not like a productive way to both get adoption of the feature and also issue those warnings, and it just ends up punishing the users. So like I'm totally fine with like, I'm still fine with keeping the warnings for import because import is like the choice of the consumer, but I'm less fine about it with the, you know, for require, because that's like the current stable non-experimental thing. But I'm also fine if we remove the warnings for import because that just encourages people to test it out.
All right. Well,
I mean, and I guess, sorry, one other thing is that like at this point, short of like, based on all of our discussions, do we expect really any changes to exports or conditional exports or self or package name resolution before we backport it? Like we've left ourselves the possibility by marking it experimental, but like short of something like require ESM happening or something, like I've gotten the impression that this is probably the final design, and like unless something, you know, new happens. So it seems like one of the safest times to start letting people use it, you know? Sorry, go ahead, Geoffrey, thank you.
I was gonna say, I would agree with that. I think I was gonna say, like, I think we can maybe leave the nitty-gritty details of this to a PR that, you know, I would say somewhere in between, something in between on the spectrum of, you know, removing all warnings for exports, conditional exports, or removing them unless the user is using some kind of flag, or removing them unless they're the author. And, you know, we can figure out in the PR like when exactly the conditions should be, but I guess, do we have agreement on that? And also that, well, so we have agreement on that. If anyone object to that? Okay, so if anyone wants to.
So I am not sure that I agree with this right now, to be honest.
Okay.
I need to spend a little more time thinking about it. And also, to be honest, I've been trying to poke around to like recreate this, and I think I may have just found a bunch of bugs. I think that conditional exports is probably something that is not going to change. Yes. But I'm not 100% comfortable with just removing all of the flags or removing the flags in a way that is inconsistent, especially since one of the things that we've tried to do here in our design is consistently offer the same support for CJS and ESM. I recognize that pragmatically there are some significant concerns here about usage and ability for people to ship, especially if it creates a warning by just trying to offer two interfaces, which could significantly hurt adoption. But I am not comfortable with us removing the warnings just yet.
Worth removing any warnings?
So for me to move forward with this, what I want to see, and I haven't seen yet, and I'm trying to do it, but I'm running into like what I think I may have just found like a really freaking weird bug with the loaders, is I would like so a great example is we just introduced the ordering change where now the order that you make the exports is how we determine it, which introduced some weird unexpected bugs in one of my projects. I just had to change the order, but it wasn't super intuitive. I'm not saying that we're going to go through and change that order, but like that's the kind of thing that could significantly change without significantly changing the exports proposal. So these things being experimental, I think, is important. Whether or not that warning is coming from the consumer side or whether or not it's from the package author side, I am not 100% convinced yet that consumers of modules should not be aware that the module that they're consuming is using an experimental API. And I'm not necessarily convinced that this is a special edge case. When we had HTTP2 and that was an experimental API, when we had FS promises and that was an experimental API, if you required or imported a package that was using those experimental APIs, you saw the warning. This isn't special for modules. Jan?
Coming back to something that I said at the very beginning, I think my reaction to that is totally fair, but for me that means we should be putting exports back behind a flag, because if no package author can,
You mean behind a warning, right?
behind a runtime flag.
I disagree with the notion that it should be put behind a flag. We want people to use it. If package authors do not want to use it because they don't want to give warnings to their package consumers, that's fine. I'm a package author. I don't mind publishing an experimental canary build that people can play with that isn't the mainline stream. I don't think putting this behind a flag and exports as a whole behind a flag is a massive step backwards. And I don't think that it needs to be so black and white.
Well, I mean, not every package author has a setup that makes it easy to have multiple release channels and publish pre-release versions. Like that is something that,
then
yes,
that project probably should not be adopting experimental features right now. If anyone wants to, if we think about it this way, the only reason why anyone would want to use this feature is if they want to introduce an experimental ESM implementation or ESM support for their package, which is still experimental.
Right, but it's similar to having an if branch in your code that's, if the user wants it, runs some feature that uses worker threads. Now, I would not expect that just because I have this if branch somewhere in my project and it's feature flagged away, every user of my package, even the ones that are not opting into this behavior, are getting a warning. Like, for example, if I would be my last job, we would have added exports to some packages to try it out, used it in some applications, set the flag in those applications, but it would have really messed with things if every other application that is not part of this experiment now gets these warnings just because that code is in the published packages.
So far what I'm hearing is it no consensus to change the status quo, possible, proposals to go in different directions. What would people think about
Brad
what's that?
Brad has their hand up and it had their hand up.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I kind of second Miles here. I don't think we should have a flag. I think package authors, it's certainly within their power to not use this feature if they don't want to see the warning. So that's something they can do. Even if they do have multiple release channels, I mean, that's not the same as what Jan was talking about with feature detection at runtime. Particularly exports, well, most ways in which you can consume a package are going to hit the exports feature before they hit any code within that package. So it seems like this is different from a feature detection if else branch. There are probably ways that you could work around that. I mean, you could have a second inner package that has it, but the whole point of exports is you're manipulating how resolution works. So anybody who's trying to consume your package is going to hit it. It's like if you had that if condition we were talking about where people might not want to use that feature at the very start of things, and you always had to check that feature, which is what gives the warning. It seems like we can't compare this to a runtime feature detection, and authors don't have to see the warning because they don't have to use the feature. So I'm not sure we need to take any action.
I think there was a misunderstanding with what you just said. So I did not mean to say that I was literally talking about an if branch in the code for this case. I compared it to worker threads and then using an if branch in my code. So for example, I'm the owner of a web platform at my last company. There are some internal libraries where I would use this feature. For example, let's say it's worker threads, not exports. So since I don't want to expose the whole fleet of applications to this feature, I make sure that it's not incidentally used by everybody. So the way I wanted to use, if I want to actually give meaningful feedback and use it in an application or two, I don't want to fork all libraries that do it. I want to keep publishing one marching line of libraries because there's a lot of releases going on. So what I want is I want to be able to publish this package in one stream of releases, and I want applications being able to opt in so that I can meaningfully test it. And I don't want random applications to see warnings or random applications potentially even to get the feature. So if my only way of doing it is either I cannot give feedback or everybody gets warnings, or I have to start forking all my packages that I want to try it out with, I will choose just not to give feedback.
I did understand your intention about not using a actual if statement. My thoughts are that this feature is always on. There is no potential for you to disable it. And there's no real
so what I was talking about was
way to compare those two. If you use this feature, it is always on, so it's unlike those packages.
Right, but I was talking about adding back a flag, and then it's not always on.
To the CLI, you mean?
To Node.
To the command line interface. Node has many things. Which flag are you asking about?
Experimental exports, the flag that we used to have.
Okay. Even then, I don't know if we really should be going towards that, because that means people wanting to use this, package authors wanting people to see how this works, and are willing to have their consumers see warnings, will basically be stuck in an even more difficult position of getting feedback. We've taken something where you're concerned about getting feedback, and we're just making it harder and harder to get feedback by not having the warnings unless you have this flag, or not having the feature at all unless you have this flag. If we do have the warnings, a package author can still ship something to get feedback. But without the flag, it becomes much more difficult to get feedback.
Jordan, and then Geoffrey, and then I have something to add. I got a demo working. I have a explicit suggestion for how we can move forward.
Okay. Well, so I'll wait to we don't have to respond to my comment until after we see Myles' suggestion, but I guess it feels like it still feels like a possibility that we could say if require triple equals default, like skip the warning, but like because given that there's no warning if I just delete require. So that was my explicit suggestion, but I'll wait. We can talk about that when Myles talks about his. Whoever's next, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the fact that conditional exports is triggering a warning, but regular exports is not, is just a bug, and we should fix that. Like they're both experimental. They should both behave the same way, and I wouldn't want. I don't think there's any like reason why we would want package authors to behave as Jordan is saying that he wants to behave, which is like to leave out require from conditional exports, but include the other things. Like either if you're using conditional exports at all, you should get the warning. I feel like, and ditto with if you're using exports at all, you should get the warning. So I don't know if we have consensus on that, at least as the interim like status quo before we make any broader decisions about removing warnings, but I wouldn't say that the current exact status quo is very defensible.
So I have a solution that requires us to do nothing. So we landed exports without a warning. Exports is a fairly fundamental change to the way in which we do things. And I think that collectively, every single person in this room, at least would be my hope, can reach consensus that exports is not going anywhere. The basic idea of exports itself. And like we talked through that a bunch. I think it is more stable than conditional. We literally made a pretty fundamental change to conditionals just between 13.6 and 13.7. So it's still hot. Fun fact, because we do not have a warning in exports proper, if you make your default the common JS entry point, there's no warning. So the pattern that we could suggest to people right now would be don't use the require. If you want an ESM entry point, specifically use the module or the import, as we call it now, use the import keyword for your ESM entry point and use the default keyword for your common JS entry point, which genuinely I think is an accurate representation of what a package is if its default entry point is in fact common JS. So the only time where
what you're describing is what all of my exports using packages are doing exactly right now.
Then they should have no warning when you require them.
And that's correct. They do not.
So I think that the places where people were complaining about the warnings, we can advise them, use import for your entry point for ESM, and use default as your entry point for common JS. If folks are doing something like their project is by default ESM and they're transpiling something to CJS, and I would personally, and I have a package that does this, I would actually keep that warning because it's experimental. But I do think that we actually have a very specific way that we can move forward for folks, which is telling them just use default for your common JS entry point, and then you won't have a warning.
Well, arguably then, that Myles, by the implication of what you're saying is that then regular exports isn't really experimental anymore.
No, APIs can still be experimental and not have a warning.
Right, but like us internally, we don't really consider it experimental. Like we think exports is pretty much baked, whereas exports is still a little hot.
But when we're talking about like the stability index inside of Node that we use, there is like from experimental to stable is a pretty huge jump. I would not say that exports is stable yet, but I would say it is stable enough in the experimental stage that we don't need to be giving a warning for it.
Okay.
Evan, you said something in the comments that package exports is breaking for ESM, i.e. type module packages. It changes the meaning of package main. Actually, Jordan, you have your hand up. Did you have more to add, or should we go to Evan's point quickly?
I mean, I can quickly reply to Evan's point, which that adding exports is breaking for every package, period, full stop.
Unless you do an export of dot slash to dots, or
Right.
if you do dot slash to dot slash.
Right.
But the idea that it breaks main was intentional. It shadows main unless you do not include a main, in which case it then goes to main, I believe. I can double check.
Oh, I guess I did want to talk about my explicit suggestion then, which builds on what you're talking about.
Okay.
So yeah, just essentially it would be exactly what you're saying, except we could get a little more adoption of conditional exports if we said that when require and default are identical, we do not issue the warning. Then I would add require to all of my packages in a way that it was the same as default. And
yeah, but
you know,
the cost of doing these extra checks is not nothing.
True.
So my thought on this is I would rather us not have an extra if statement and check on every single entry point personally, as we're going through the algorithm. If we have a solution that we can offer people that works.
Well, I mean, we already have an if statement that checks the presence of require, presumably, right? So this would be for that, for only if that's there, it would be if require is present, and then we'd alter it to add and require equals, you know, default or something to that effect. But yeah, it's not zero cost. That's fair.
I think like the other thing to think about there is like it also creates inconsistent results from a warning perspective across versions. It's not a huge deal, but it's like if we have a solution that doesn't involve us changing anything. And personally, I think if we're thinking about it in the sense of like how exports works versus conditional exports, if we're saying conditional exports is still experimental, default is just supported by exports already. So like you're not actually using the conditional exports feature when people use default as the export. So I think that is like very clear, and it's like a clear separation of the two features.
Maybe that makes sense to me too.
Evan, did you have anything else that you wanted to add about the breaking change that you mentioned? Okay. We have 5 minutes left. We spent a lot of time on this one. The other things that we had on here is doc review, various effects of type field. Brad, is there an update for that?
No, we just really need to figure out what the intended behavior is for all those. So
Okay.
feel free to comment on that issue.
So folks could go in that issue. That'd be great. The next one we have here is unflagging 12.x on LTS. As a quick update, we are neck and neck now between the 12.x Semver minor release and what we've got on 13. That includes the logical ordering stuff. I backported that this week. There's a security release planned for next week and a 12 Semver minor planned the week after. So that should go out in about 2 weeks' time. Anyone have questions about that? Aside from that, when we're talking about like longer term, I think we're still on track for April as a potential target date to unflag on 12. April will also be when we cut 14. And I think at some point between April and October is when we should consider removing the various warnings that we have. But I think that is a different conversation. I'm just adding notes. Chartering the modules team. I think 3 minutes is not enough time to really talk about that. There's still some work to be done there. Although with that being said, doesn't seem to be slowing us down. Anyone have specific thoughts around this? Okay, loader hooks. Anyone have a quick update? I know Jeff had some new loader hooks that landed and we've got that backported to 12 also. Anything else to add reloader hooks for right now? Cool then, and then
I could add one thing to that is as part of, I haven't gotten around to this yet, but I was talking to, I think Derek volunteered to help try to rewrite the README for the modules repo. And as part of that, I wanted to go through that list of user requirements for loaders that we had from way back when, and see how many were satisfied by the current implementation. And part of that will involve like actually writing some more loaders to see if it's actually achievable, like stubs. Can we achieve stubs using our current like loader interception capabilities? Like, I don't know. So yeah, if anyone wants to help with that effort, and kind of see how many of those we can check off, and then how many remain, and which is more importantly, which ones remain. I know the stuff about like swapping out source text of an already loaded module is, I think, something that's still unachievable, that I think people were talking about using like the debugger API for and stuff.
Yeah, V8 still doesn't allow us to do that. So even with the debugger.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so then yeah, so there's more work to be done in there, and we should talk about it in somewhere, an issue thread or something.
Okay, cool. With 1 minute left and one issue left, I will read the name of it, patch instrument to module. Is there any quick updates on that?
I think that's probably the same thing I was just talking about with stubbing, right?
Okay, cool. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and stop the call. Thanks everyone for joining today. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Talk to y'all soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.